Welcome to the office of the Vancouver Symphony. I'm Ashley Johnson.
And I'm Greg Scholl, trombonist in the Vancouver Symphony. Welcome to Da Capo.
A very exciting piece on our program this weekend, Tchaikovsky's First Piano Concerto. A very well-loved piece, but it got off to a rather dramatic start, I understand.
That's right. This piece was composed in 1874 and 1875. It was premiered in the United States, in Boston, by Hans von Bülow, after the first choice to premiere the piece, which was Nikolai Rubinstein, criticized the piece. And Rubinstein later withdrew that criticism and became a fervent champion of this work. It's one of Tchaikovsky's best-known pieces and a very popular concerto.
So it's a really curious thing to criticize a piece before it has been premiered or published.
That's right. It's long thought that Tchaikovsky dedicated this work to Rubinstein, or planned to. Nikolai Rubinstein's name was written on the top of the score, but then later Tchaikovsky crossed it out.
Ooh.
He wanted Rubinstein to premiere this work, and so he invited Rubinstein over to his place, and he played it for him without the orchestra, of course, just on the piano. Played it for Rubinstein and said, "I'm hoping for you to premiere this piece."
I have a feeling it didn't go well.
We know that it did not go well because Tchaikovsky wrote it all down. Rubinstein was silent at first after hearing Tchaikovsky play through this piece and just sort of sat there staring at Tchaikovsky. And finally Tchaikovsky said, "Well," and this is what Tchaikovsky wrote about Rubinstein's reaction. "It turned out that my concerto was worthless and unplayable. Passages were so fragmented, so clumsy, so badly written that they were beyond rescue. The work itself was bad and vulgar. In places I had stolen from other composers. Only 2 or 3 pages were worth preserving. The rest must be thrown away or completely rewritten." Rubinstein was walking over saying, "Here, for instance, this. Now, what's all that?" And sort of caricatured the music on the piano. "And this, how can anyone write this?" Tchaikovsky wrote, "I left the room without a word and went upstairs. In my agitation and rage, I could not say a thing. Presently, Rubinstein joined me, and seeing how upset I was, he asked me to another room. There, he repeated that my concerto was impossible, pointed out many places where it would have to be completely revised, and said that if within a limited time I reworked the concerto according to his demands, then he would do me the honor of playing my thing at his concert. I shall not alter a single note," I answered. "I shall publish the work exactly as it is," and that's what Tchaikovsky did.
So how then did Hans von Bülow get involved with this work?
Well, Tchaikovsky picked him out. He had heard Hans von Bülow play in 1874 and liked the performance very much. And then he heard that von Bülow was a fan of his own writing. And so he contacted Hans von Bülow and said, "Would you like to premiere this piece?" Now, it just so happens that Hans von Bülow wanted to do it, but he was about to embark on a tour of the United States, and that's how it was decided that the piece would be premiered in Boston. Tchaikovsky liked that idea because although he was proud of the concerto and didn't change it according to Rubinstein's wishes, he was afraid that perhaps it wasn't any good, and so it would be better to premiere it somewhere far away from home, where the fallout would not be quite as severe as it would be if he had had it premiered in Russia.
Well, did the Americans receive it better than Rubinstein?
Yes, the audience loved it. They gave him a long-standing ovation. In fact, Hans von Bülow had to come out and repeat the finale for the audience, played the whole last movement again, and Tchaikovsky was astonished but very pleased that that's what happened.
And what was the critical reception?
Well, the audience loved it, but the critics, they didn't like it so much. Some wrote it's hardly destined to become a classic, and also during that premiere performance, there were some problems. The brass entered in the wrong place, and Hans von Bülow was playing on the stage and was heard to audibly yell, "The brass may go to hell." The audience heard that, still didn't prevent them from enjoying the concert. And the work fared much better in terms of performance quality and critics' reception a week or two later when it was played in New York City.
Then when did it premiere in Russia?
So after these American performances, a few weeks later, the piece was played that we're still in 1875. A pianist named Gustav Kross was the person that premiered it in St. Petersburg, and Tchaikovsky hated that performance. Again, we always have these emotional hyperbole coming down, and he said that Gustav Kross reduced his piano concerto to an atrocious cacophony.
So after that point, it was performed in Moscow. What made that performance notable?
Well, this performance went better than the one in St. Petersburg, but the ironic thing, the weird thing, is that the Moscow performance was conducted by Nikolai Rubinstein, the piano player who was supposed to premiere the piece in the first place, but didn't like it. Well, now he had come around and he really liked the piece, so he conducted that performance. And Sergei Taneyev was the piano soloist in the Vancouver Symphony. We have played some of the symphonic works by Taneyev, who wasn't just a player, he was also a composer. You know, Nikolai Rubinstein went on to play this piano concerto many times all over Europe and became a huge champion of this work in spite of his earlier belief that it was impossible and no one could ever play it. In fact, he was so in love with it that he insisted that Tchaikovsky would dedicate his next piano concerto number 2, to Nikolai Rubinstein, but he passed away before that could take place.
Did Tchaikovsky ever warm up to the idea of criticism?
You know, he was such an emotional person by all accounts and was very moody. And although he was outraged at the criticism that Rubinstein made of his first piano concerto, later on he did end up editing the piece and took advice from different pianists and different music people about how it should go. There was a German pianist named Edward Dannreuther. There was a Russian pianist who also helped Tchaikovsky make some changes to the work. And some of those might be reflected in our performance this weekend. The piece was written to have the piano start playing first, and it plays chords that are arpeggiated. One note of the chord sounds at a time. It's kind of rolling of a chord. And a change was made by Tchaikovsky because people told him it would be better to play the chords as block chords. Instead of arpeggiating them or rolling them, you can just play the chords as giant block chords. At the time of our recording today, I don't know what our soloist is going to do, so we'll all find that out together.
Exciting. We'll have to listen for it. So, an interesting little fun fact, this piece is particularly known to fans of the sports world.
Yes, that's right. In 2021, the World Anti-Doping Agency banned Russia from all major sporting competitions, and that's a ban that lasted until 2023, and it included the Olympics, which was a big deal. Some athletes from Russia, however, were cleared to compete, not as Russian citizens or for the country of Russia, but as a group called the Russian Olympic Committee Paralympic Committee. And they were allowed to compete, but there could be no symbols of Russia, no flags, nothing like that. It's kind of like they're Russian, but they're not Russians.
Not today.
And instead of using the Russian national anthem when they got on the podium to accept a reward or when they came into the stadium with the torch and things like that, an excerpt of Tchaikovsky's first piano concerto was played to accompany them.
Very interesting. So what are some versions of note from history?
Well, Vladimir Horowitz, one of the most famous players ever, performed this piece in 1943 with Arturo Toscanini, a very famous conductor, at the helm. And this was released as a recording, so you can hear what these heavyweight champs of piano music did with this work. Also, Horowitz recorded and released a 1941 version. So those are some pretty old recordings of this work that are still available today. The famous pianist Van Cliburn won the first international Tchaikovsky competition in 1958 by playing this piece. And that was a big surprise for a lot of people, as he was an American. He was competing in Moscow, and this was during the height of the Cold War. And after the performance of that piece, he received a standing ovation that lasted 8+ minutes. So people were very impressed with his efforts. And he subsequently made a LP recording of the work on the RCA label. And that's the first classical record that ever achieved platinum status in terms of sales.
Wow.
Sviatoslav Richter in 1962 recorded this piece with Herbert von Karajan and the Vienna Symphony Orchestra. He actually recorded it 4 times, 1954, 1957, 1958, and 1968. So you can hear a lot of versions of this. You can find them on YouTube and other places if you want to hear what some of these superstars did with this material.
Obviously, it goes without saying, Tchaikovsky's body of work is remarkable. Where does the First Piano Concerto fit within it?
You know, I think of Tchaikovsky as a composer who has music that is just really infused with a lot of emotionalism. There's just this surcharge of moodiness and music that goes up and down. It's triumphant and exultant, and then 1 minute later it sounds like we're all completely doomed and there's no hope. That type of emotionalism is not quite so present. It's mostly present in his symphonies. It's not so present in this piano concerto. This one, to me, sounds more like fireworks. You've got just a dynamite, very obviously difficult and impressive piano part that's loud and boisterous. It sounds like fireworks, but it sounds like very high-quality fireworks.
Well, it'll be fun to hear it performed by the VSO, and we'll see if the audience receives it as well as the Bostonians did at the premiere.
I predict they will.
There is another heavy hitter on this weekend's program that happens to be my favorite ballet of all time, Igor Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring.
That's right. This is a piece that is always preceded by its reputation. And this, I think, more than any other work, really qualifies as a shocker. It was a shocker when it was premiered, and it sounded outrageous then, and I think it still sounds outrageous even to audiences today.
What context did this work come out of?
This came out of nationalism in Russia. The music that had been evolving in Russia during the last half of the 19th century was focused on a Russian cultural ethos and Russian folklore and things like that. Stravinsky was a very young composer at the turn of the century. He started writing music based on these Russian folk ideas, but his music was different from what anyone had ever heard before, not just in Russia, but anywhere in the world. And so he wrote 3 very famous ballets when he was in his 20s: Firebird, Petrushka, and The Rite of Spring. Petrushka itself was seen as this kind of barbaric and brutal sounding music because it's very rhythmically oriented and it's got a lot of dissonance and things like that. But no way did Petrushka or anything else compare to The Rite of Spring. Mm-hmm. This type of music was so modern. Nobody had ever done or heard anything like this at all. They hadn't even come close.
What was the inspiration behind this ballet?
Stravinsky said that he dreamt of a pagan scene, again from kind of some type of older Russian folk situation. And he dreamed of a woman in this pagan rite sort of dancing herself to death. But he saw that in his head as a ballet that should be done in a very modern style, which is what he accomplished.
So you alluded to this piece's reputation preceding it. The premiere in particular is a story that gets told again and again.
That's right. It's famous, or perhaps infamous, the way you look at it. The premiere was in 1913, and The Rite of Spring begins in a very unusual way with this solo bassoon playing in a very high octave for the bassoon. It's very exposed. It's a very ethereal, spooky kind of sound. And when this music started in the concert hall, there was immediate laughter. People couldn't believe what they were listening to. And that turned into catcalls. And that turned into people yelling and all kinds of hell breaking loose in this auditorium. No one could hear the music when they were in the audience, and the dancers that were on the stage couldn't hear the music. And so Stravinsky himself went backstage and helped the choreography people clap and try to shout out the numbers to the dancers so they could keep things together because they couldn't hear the orchestra anymore. It's said that the rioting in the theater became so intense that Stravinsky had to escape the whole scene by crawling out of a bathroom window onto the street. This was a shocking and sort of terrible but amazing premiere, and it's really the way that Stravinsky cemented his own reputation as the new apostle of modernism. This was very cutting-edge stuff. Even though that nationalism sort of underpinning is still present, it was blown up into something totally new and totally different.
Absolutely. Well, especially alongside Nijinsky's really shocking choreography. It must have been a sight to behold.
I wish I could have seen it.
Well, Stravinsky himself is known to have had quite the rivalry with Claude Debussy.
That's right. Stravinsky ended up living in France some of the time, and he became friends with Debussy, although they did have a somewhat unhealthy rivalry. Debussy was often very critical of Stravinsky, even though they were friends, and he attended ballet rehearsals and things like that for Stravinsky's works. He wrote about seeing Stravinsky in those days, and he wrote, "I have recently seen Stravinsky. He says, my Rite of Spring, or my this piece or that piece, just as a child says, my toy, my hoop." And that is exactly what he is, a spoiled child who sometimes cocks a snook at music. He's also a young barbarian who wears flashy ties and treads on women's toes as he kisses their hands. When he is old, he will be unbearable. That is to say, he will admit no other music, but for the moment, he is unbelievable. He professes a friendship for me because I have helped him to mount a rung of the ladder from which he launches his squibs, not all of which explode. But once again, he is unbelievable. You have really understood him, and even better than I have been able to understand the unrelenting workings of his mind. So they had a healthy rivalry, and they were both willing to write about it and say whatever they wanted about the other person.
Well, speaking of writing about it, Stravinsky is not one of those composers that remains a mystery to us today.
No, he wrote a lot, and that's why we know what his opinions are. And some of the things that he said were outrageous, like, "To me, a saxophone always sounds like a pink slimy worm." He had a lot of quotes like that are somewhat outrageous and probably not exactly what he thought. But he wrote a lot. He wrote a lot of music criticism. He wrote a lot of books. He wrote a lot of letters. And then he befriended a younger conductor and sometime composer named Robert Kraft in the last half of the 20th century. And they had lots of conversations, and Robert Kraft ended up editing those and putting those together in a series of books that you can read where they have this back and forth dialogue about music and things like that. So he's not a mystery to us. We know a lot of what Stravinsky thought.
So he's also known for having quite drastic changes in his music over his career.
That's right. You know, he was a chameleon of sorts. He moved through a lot of the 20th century musical trends. Polytonality, where you have music in different keys at the same time. Neoclassicism, which is really the direction he turned to after his famous ballet period, where composers started to simplify things and go back to the classical forms and try to make music that sort of sounded like Haydn or something, but it just had a little bit of a modern feel to it. He experimented with serialism, where you write 12-tone music and you have to use each note the same number of times, and there's a lot of mathematical formulas to it. He wrote music for small groups as well as super orchestras with super scores. But the thing about Stravinsky is, as he tried all these different things, everything he came up with was really good. He was able to sort of take this and take that and move through these different phases that were popular and experiment with them and come up with things on his own that were always very high quality, but then he didn't get nailed down and went on to the next thing.
I understand he even dabbled in jazz.
Yes, he was influenced by American jazz, but interestingly enough, he only knew it by sheet music. He never heard jazz when he started writing those types of rhythms and those types of chords. He borrowed the jazz style not as it was played in America in the first part of the 20th century, because there weren't recordings. He couldn't hear that music. But he saw it because people showed him sheet music that was an attempt to sort of codify what was going on in jazz bands. And so he used those elements in some of his smaller chamber works, really to great effect. You know, jazz music, the way it's written down, doesn't necessarily match the way that it sounds, but you can still see some of those effects and hear some of that rhythm in his work.
I understand that as his career progressed, his own ideas about music grew more abstract.
That's right. You know, he represents just a complete rupture with Romanticism. This idea that music is supposed to convey an emotion or a specific motive or idea or character. These things started becoming less and less attractive to modern composers, and Stravinsky helped lead that charge. In fact, by the end, he said it's not music's job to express anything. Composers combine notes, and that is all that we do. And this was not just related to music, right? Other areas of art in the 20th century started to experiment with these types of concepts. For instance, abstract painters. If you think about a painting that has some apples in a bowl, they are the object of the painting, and the subject of the painting is a representation of these apples. Well, abstract painters started to decide, I'm not going to have an object in my painting, but I still have a subject to my painting. It's still about something, it's just not about this object. And that's what Stravinsky's saying. It's not music's job to express something. We're putting notes together, and that is what abstraction means in modern art.
What was his approach to composition like?
He was super organized, and he was super tidy, and he was very logical, and he was very workmanlike. Here's a description of what his approach to writing music would be. Stravinsky had set hours in the day. He would get up and eat breakfast and then sort of clock in at the piano and start writing until it was lunchtime. He kept a very rigid schedule. One writer who was working with Stravinsky in the middle part of the 20th century wrote, "Stravinsky's scores are magnificent. He is above all, in matters of every sense of the word, a calligrapher. His writing desk resembled a surgeon's instrument case. Bottles of different colored inks in their ordered hierarchy, each had a separate part to play in the ordering of his art. Near at hand were India rubbers of various kinds and shapes, and all sorts of glittering steel implements, rulers, erasers, penknives, and a roulette instrument for drawing musical stabs, invented by Stravinsky himself." So he had this very organized workspace, and if you look at the scores that he wrote, you know, a Beethoven score, it's got scratches and everything looks kind of messy, and there's lots of erasures, and it's just kind of a mess. Stravinsky looks much more logical and clean. The notes are perfect. Everything's perfectly put together.
He has been claimed to be the most important composer of the 20th century. What do you think of that assertion?
Well, it's probably true. I mean, he did turn into this apostle of modernism for both critics, musicians, and the public alike. colleagues saw him as this very precise and polished technician in the way the music's put together. Up until World War II, I think it's irrefutable that he was the strongest influence of them all on the contemporary music scene. Lots of composers have their sort of heyday or their popularity for one thing or another, but Stravinsky pulled everybody into a new direction. He really, in the 20th century, influenced the course of music like nobody else. He really changed the direction that things were going. And that's not unlike what his friend Pablo Picasso did for painting and visual arts, really changing everything for everybody.
Then Picasso and Stravinsky had certain similarities as artists.
It's true. Not only were they friends, but they both simultaneously entered into different sort of stylistic periods than they ended up in. They both used distortion, either by color or by sound, for expressive purposes within the things that they were creating. And they both had an enormous influence on their contemporaries and on everything up to the avant-garde. And they both were brilliant craftsmen. So they had a lot in common, even though they worked in very different fields.
A notable memory from my own childhood is, of course, Rite of Spring's inclusion in Disney's original Fantasia film.
That's right, the 1940 animated film by Disney, which most of us saw multiple times. It does use an abridged version of the music from Rite of Spring, and Disney chose to have as the subject matter these sort of primordial dinosaur kind of...
It's very grotesque.
It's pretty wild. Stravinsky didn't like that at all. He didn't want his music to be seen as having that sort of programmatic aspect to it, but he was powerless to stop the production because he'd already lost the copyrights to the music Rite of Spring. That's based on the vagaries of international copyright law after the Russian Revolution. He didn't own the rights to his works anymore, so Disney was able to kind of take that idea and run with it.
Well, I agree with Stravinsky. I don't like their treatment of it either.
I read later that he softened up and grew to enjoy it, but that might not be true.
Well, at the very least, it's flattering to have your work represented by the Disney animators. So, this is a first for the VSO.
That's right. We've never played this piece before, and I'm going to take a little bit of credit for that because a few years ago I started bothering Salvador Brotons and saying the seasons are kind of piling up behind us and it's time to start thinking about trying to do the Rite of Spring. And surprisingly enough, he told me he had not conducted it before. And then last year he told me that he was going to put it on the program. I believe it's a milestone for the Vancouver Symphony for a couple different reasons. Our orchestra was probably not capable of playing this work until the last year or two. It's very difficult to play. It's very difficult to rehearse. It's also super expensive. You have to hire a bunch of extra musicians to create this really large ensemble. I've been looking forward to playing this piece for a long time, and so I'm very excited to see how it all turns out.
I'm very pleased that you got your way because, like I said, it is a big favorite of mine. This is going to be really exciting to hear at Skyview Concert Hall, and I'm so excited that we get to bring it to Vancouver.
Me too.
Thank you so much for tuning in early and for joining us for another season of Capo. Have a wonderful concert, and we look forward to seeing you again in September. Enjoy.